welcome everybody to our session on prospects for digital trade in the Asia Pacific in 2024. I'm delighted to have with us the author of what is now the third in a series of examinations of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. The first paper was a review of its importance and likely impact, and now there have been two subsequent papers on implementation, specifically implementation of the digital chapter. And we are going to focus today particularly on digital issues. I think what you'll see from the data is that CPTPP is becoming, I think, a key regional trade agreement in Asia. It is expanding its membership, and that's something we'll discuss. And it is, I think, ultimately going to become the leader in terms of digital provisions and digital trade provisions in the region. And so I think it's important that we take a look at how that's going. And the current paper that's will be available soon, along with the slides you're going to see in a couple of minutes, are going to show that the degree to which implementation is taking place and what more needs to be done. And then after our author, who I'll introduce in a minute, presents the paper, we're going to have a panel discussion, not only about it, but about the importance of digital trade and the implications for digital trade that CPTPP has in the region, and how all this relates, particularly to the United States, which is not a member of CPTPP. Big mistake in my view, but people that listen to me know that. And also how it relates to IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is the U.S. Effort to create a trade agreement in the region. And those of you that follow IPEF know that the trade pillar was not concluded at the November summit. And in particular, even what was an expected early harvest of items, including some digital items, did not take place. So we'll talk a little bit about how all of that intersects with CPTP as well. But we're going to begin with a presentation of the paper. And for that, I'm very happy to introduce Kati Suominen, who is an adjunct fellow here at the Scholl Chair International Business, where she focuses especially on digitization, disruptive technologies, and trade. Probably more important, I like to think nothing is more important than CSIS, but probably more important in reality, she's also the founder and CEO of the Los Angeles-based Next Trade Group, which helps governments, development banks, and Fortune 500 technology companies enable trade through technology. Her clients have included the World Bank, the IFC, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, USAID, UK Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office, companies like MasterCard, Visa, Google, and eBay, and many others. Kati is the author or editor of over 100 papers and 10 books, demonstrating that she has a lot more energy than I do, and is also the author of the first two papers prior to this one. All of these are available on our website. Following her presentation, we're going to go to a panel, and I'll introduce the panelists at that time. For everybody there, we have there is supposed to be on your screen a Q&A button at the bottom. If you want to ask a question, click on that. I think after Kati finishes, we won't have Q&A for her. She's going to sit on the panel, and we're going to go directly to the panel from her. So we'll save time at the end of the whole event for questions for Kati and for our panelists. So with that, let me turn it over to Kati and share your screen with the presentation you've got.
Thanks very much, Bill, and thank you all for very much, Bill, and thank you all for joining. Really exciting times, I think, for us to kickstart the year with a great discussion on Asia-Pacific trade in 2024. As Bill mentioned, we've had a chance to look at the implementation of the Asia-Pacific trade agreements, particularly the CPTPP, in the past couple of years, and I'll share the results of this prior year's evaluation. Hopefully we'll do this many times in years to come. And then I'll tee it up for Juliana and Jonathan to discuss more broadly the Asia-Pacific trade landscape and dynamics, perhaps particularly in light of what many of you are here for, which is to discuss the kind of US retreat from the digital trade policy landscape in the past couple of months. So I'll go right in. So why the importance of kind of monitoring the implementation? Why are we even talking about this? Well, I think number of reasons. One reason is that there has been an explosion, particularly in the Asia Pacific, of digital trade agreements, digital economy agreements, as well as e-commerce chapters within trade agreements that will critically shape the future of digital trade, and I would say trade in general in the region, as well as more globally. As we know, the CPTPP covered 11 countries when it started, and now the UK exceeded this past year. And as Bill mentioned, there are many countries that want to apply for membership. So it's becoming the anchor among many trade agreements that are shaping the landscape in the region. Now, another reason why monitoring the implementation of these trade rules is important is just the sheer significance of e-commerce. There's been a dramatic growth in e-commerce transactions domestically in the Asia-Pacific economies, which of course has great implications for firms as well as consumers. Increasing share of consumers' consumption every year is going into digital transactions and purchases of goods, and there's also more and more digital transactions of services, including across borders. So digitally deliverable trade was actually the trade that held up very well during COVID. Its share increased of all commercial services trade, and it's becoming increasingly important. It's really the growth center of international trade in general, has grown very rapidly in the region. In fact, US digitally deliverable services exports have also grown by 6% over the past 10 years annually to the region. So this is also very important for US digital trade. CPTPP region businesses have also really taken advantage of e-commerce. Most businesses, whether they are micro, small, medium, are using marketplaces today, which enable them then to reach consumers across borders and scale their sales and streamline their operations as well. And we actually found in some other work we did with UPS this past year is that companies that are using e-commerce intensively and using marketplaces, deriving maybe 25% or more of their sales online, have been diversifying very rapidly. Their export markets, about 50% of them diversified their markets during COVID, compared to just 30% of companies that were not using e-commerce as intensively. So e-commerce is really correlated with the export performance as well. And not only that, there is more and more businesses in the Asia-Pacific region that are serving the online sellers and e-commerce players, including businesses in fintech sectors, payments, marketplaces, logistics companies that are technology enabled. And of course, digital trade rules also shape the fortunes of these kinds of companies that are underpinning the digital trade and the sellers that are emerging in Asia Pacific. And finally, I think the trade rules that we're setting now and implementing, and their implementation will really shape the future of FDI in the region as well. So we actually looked at, as a proxy for technology-related FDIs, the office locations of largest technology companies in the world. And of course, there's substantial presence of these kinds of companies, about 12% of them. If you look at all kinds of offices, over 2,000 around the world, 12% are in the CPTPP region, more in the Asia Pacific as well. As you can see, a huge concentration in India. But as we're thinking about digital trade rules of the future, those will critically shape the fortunes of countries to access these kinds of high knowledge-intensive FDI as well in their economies and create new well-paying jobs. So I think there's a number of reasons why the rules of the game really matter. They particularly matter today, and why we need to really focus on the implementation of these trade agreements. Another reason why we really need to focus on the implementation is that there isn't really a very robust mechanism as yet in place to do this. The CPTPP e-commerce a committee on e-commerce actually did set up a mechanism to discuss the implementation of the CPTPP. So governments have realized that this is an important area, but there's not been kind of official assessments yet of the implementation. So, coming from the private sector, coming from a think tank community, I think these assessments are very, very useful for the government as well, as they are grappling with the implementation. So where are we with the implementation of these trade agreements? Well, first of all, for those that have not necessarily followed that closely as we have, CPTPP was a key agreement signed in 2018 or went into effect in 2018 and had a template of digital trade rules that have then been subsequently adopted in multiple trade agreements, pretty much to the letter, on issues like having a moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions, so that digital purchases don't face duties essentially at the borders. There are critical rules on banning data localization, enabling companies to move data across borders that then, of course, facilitates their e-commerce. And there are commitments for countries to, for instance, protect consumers' personal information, protect consumers in electronic transactions, and prevent, for instance, consumers from having to deal with spam. There are commitments for cybersecurity collaboration and things like that. So there's really a robust template that has become the template for the region as well, and then subsequently been expanded on by a number of countries like Australia in its agreements, and Juliana will probably talk a great deal about this, into areas that are now really top of mind for businesses large and small, like AI governance and open government data, as well as the treatment of online liability and internet intermediaries, liability in copyright infringements, for instance. So this template, this exercise, I think is very relevant, particularly as the countries that are here that have been forming these trade agreements on top of CPTPP have, are basically the CPTPP members themselves. So the exercise that we've done perhaps is very relevant for these many other agreements. And businesses, as we're asking them about the relevance of CPTPP rules for them, or Asia-Pacific companies, as we surveyed over 1,000 firms for this study, they find these rules very beneficial for their businesses. Over 40% think that the cybersecurity protections, for instance, in CPTPP are very beneficial for them. A third of companies value as very beneficial the ability to move data. Over 75% of companies think that this is a very beneficial rule for them, and protecting companies' source code as well. For instance, source code in software that is being sold to third markets. Protecting that source code is also seen as highly relevant by businesses in the region. So I think businesses really value these kinds of rules and want to see them implemented. In fact, when we asked companies about 12 different priorities that they would have for the CPTPP, they overwhelmingly mentioned that the implementation of the CPTPP rules is a top priority. 80%, 90% of companies find the enforcement and implementation as very relevant. And perhaps this also tells us something about the need to implement this agreement even better by many economies. So what we did to try to get our arms around how countries are actually implementing their commitments in CPTPP, we looked at the various provisions in CPTPP and then looked at these against, for instance, countries' laws. For instance, data privacy. Does CPTPP requires countries to have a data privacy law? Well, we looked at whether a country has a data privacy law in place. We looked at also some business surveys, as I was showing just then, about how businesses see countries as meeting, for instance, the provisions on non-discrimination of digital products. How we looked at some external data on cybersecurity indices, cybersecurity implementation by different countries, on how countries are in the CPTPP meeting their cybersecurity commitments, and so on. So we used a number of sources to seek to identify whether countries are implementing their commitments, where they are on the implementation journey, as well is one way to think about it as well. And majority of these assessments that we did were based on laws. So we just looked at whether a country has the requisite law in place and assigned basically a traffic light, whether a country has implemented or partly implemented or has not implemented their commitments. Now, this is methodologically very challenging exercise for anybody who has tried to do something like this. You can immediately see that it's not easy to categorize laws and policies into three buckets, but this is what we attempted to do, just to get at least a back of the envelope sense of what is going on. And as we know, some of these provisions like data transfer, so CPTPP, for instance, calls for cross-border data transfer, allowing that to happen. And why is this relevant? Where companies, particularly companies that are selling online and exporting online, are constantly exporting and importing also data across the region. So for businesses, these provisions are very critical. Companies that don't engage in trade, for them, of course, the movement of data across borders is a little bit less relevant, but also still matters. It is really the online sellers, exporters that care about these rules. There's a number of other rules that are in the CPTPP, for instance, companies to ban companies from locating computing facilities in a certain market, enabling companies to basically store data where they want. And companies or countries cannot also give foreign companies less favorable treatment on digital products than they accord to their domestic companies. There's the source code protection, where countries cannot require companies to hand off over source code of software as a condition of market access and things like that. So we sought to understand how countries are meeting these kinds of provisions in the CPTPP. And here's the result for 2023, very similar to actually the 2022, some improvements as well. But we see that there's still improvements that could be made in the protection of source code, for instance. And this is based on business surveys where businesses say, well, hey, I would like better, I'm facing some challenges as I'm seeking to sell software, for instance, across CPTPP markets. And this could be implemented better. Same for the non-discrimination of digital products at the borders. This is also based on business surveys. And, we saw some room for improvement based on those. Then there are some other areas like data transfer, data localization, where actually most of the countries are doing very well, but some implementation required still from countries like Vietnam, for instance. But in the main, pretty good picture of implementation, yet still some work ahead, particularly in Brunei, Vietnam, and some Latin American countries, Malaysia. And here is the kind of detailed mapping, and this will be available in the paper that Bill mentioned, of how countries are actually meeting their commitments based on the template that I just flagged. And I think paperless trade, there's a lot of still work ahead for countries, even the more advanced ones, on implementing all their paperless trade commitments. Businesses still complain, as I mentioned, about the discrimination on digital products at the borders, protection of source code. And then there are cybersecurity capabilities that, of course, need to be bolstered in any one country, but particularly the Latin American countries, I think, are still behind on cybersecurity implementation. Vietnam, we flagged for data privacy and data transfer because of number of decrees and laws that have been rolled out in the past couple of years in Vietnam. I won't go into these details, but there are laws that have been very concerning for US technology companies as well as tech companies in the region and e-commerce players, such as the Decree 53 that was rolled out a couple of years ago, where companies would have to store data in Vietnam if they are flagged by the government for breaching, for instance, the cybersecurity law. So there's a number of reasons why we flag Vietnam as needing work in these areas. Businesses, how do businesses see the overall picture of implementation? Well, Australia and New Zealand come out on top and as the good members, if you want, that are implementing very well. And some of the countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Chile requiring some more work from businesses' point of view. So, I think what this gives us is, of course, we need to work still on things like data transfer, source code protection, enabling the digital electronic transmissions, particularly market access for digital products that seem to be coming out of this. There's much more detail in the report that we'll share with you. And then, of course, cybersecurity is another area where we need more work in general, not only in the CPTPP region, but across the board. And if we're thinking about kind of what the future holds for the CPTPP, I think we need to keep, of course, monitoring these trade agreements, particularly in light of the ASEAN, which is now negotiating its first digital economy framework agreement, which is kind of the first South-South agreement, if you want, on digital trade. And the implementation of these provisions is also very, very important for these poorer countries, if you want, in the region as well. I would say there's also new policies and complexities that are impacting Asia-Pacific trade. So there's a need for kind of looking at new trade provisions, perhaps in the CPTPP region. Could we think about CPTPP 2.0 even, that would modernize the rules that were agreed on in 2018? And then, should we think about CPTPP also in light of the AI governance, online liability rules? Perhaps we should rethink some of these provisions in light of the commitments that countries have already taken in other trade agreements. And then, finally, what we find in some of this work when we ask businesses, well, what would you like to see as the future of the CPTPP? Many businesses actually want to promote the CPTPP rules in IPEF more broadly, and would like very much for the United States to engage in CPTPP and re-engage in IPEF digital discussions. And furthermore, there are many countries that want to join the CPTPP. So there's many moving parts in the Asia-Pacific digital trade landscape, and there's a great deal of demand for better new rules, perhaps on, for instance, interoperable payments, on AI governance, on digital standards, for instance, for things like invoices and bills of lading to facilitate trade. So as we asked businesses, what would you like to see from the CPTPP going forward? Not only do they want implementation, but they want kind of modernized rules. So this is perhaps for our panel also to discuss this, the future rules and then the future membership. We asked businesses, who would you like to see as a next member in the CPTPP? And again, almost 2/3 of businesses said, well, US would be a great partner for us. And we would like to also expand these CPTPP rules beyond CPTPP to IPEF and other regions, or grow CPTPP, perhaps, is another way to think about it. So there's a lot of demand for new rules, for US engagement in the region. And I think we need to, for the United States, I think re-engagement on digital trade is absolutely paramount in light of these dynamics, in light of course, US businesses looking for e-commerce opportunities, in light of the importance of being around the table when new rules are being discussed. I mean, train has already left the station. Governments are thinking about AI regulations. They are thinking about cloud rules. They're thinking about digital competition policy, and the US is kind of absent currently in my view, from this discussion. So there's really an imperative for the US to come back to the table and play a leading role. And I would say a lot of this falls probably in an election year on US Congress as well to join. So that's on my side. I think we have these two issues of how do we create a robust Asia-Pacific trade landscape. How do we implement these great provisions and commitments that have been adopted? How do we help countries like in the ASEAN that are now negotiating their own digital trade agreement? And how do we ensure that the United States is around the table when we're discussing the future of CPTPP and future of digital trade, looking at new applicants to CPTPP as well? All developments that are very relevant for US businesses as well. So thanks very much, Bill. I'm turning it over back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Kati. That was a really thorough presentation. For our viewers, we're going to post the slides, and the paper is not quite ready for publication yet. It's still going through the editorial process, but as soon as that's finished, we'll post that as well, so you'll be able to access it. Let me now turn to the panel. I'm sorry to say that one of our panelists, Professor Ang, has been taken ill, and I think is not going to be able to join us today. But we do have two other distinguished people who are going to more than fill the gap, and Kadi's joining the panel as well. So I think we should have a good discussion. The two panelists are first Juliana Nam, who is the Minister Counselor for Trade at the Embassy of Australia here in Washington. Prior to that, she was the Assistant Secretary of FTA Policy and Implementation at the Department of Foreign Affairs Trade in Australia. She also served as a Brussels-based diplomat, leading efforts across Europe to promote Australia's interests in the bilateral FTA negotiations with the EU. And before that, she was a CPTPP deputy negotiator. So she has a lot of experience on this specific agreement and with trade negotiations in particular, and I'm delighted that she is going to be able to join us. We also have a name and person that will be very familiar to most of you because he's been doing this for a long time, and that's Jonathan McHale, who is currently the Vice President for Digital Trade at the Computer and Communications Industry Association, where he leads their digital trade advocacy in the U.S. and international fora. Up until 2022, he was Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for ICT Services and Digital Trade, where he spent a very long time there working to open markets in exactly this field, in the telecommunications and digital trade sectors at both USTR and before that at State. He was lead negotiator for the USMCA Digital Trade Chapter, the telecommunications and electronic commerce issues in what was at the time TPP, as well as the Korea Agreement, the Australia Agreement, and the Singapore Agreement. So he has a long set of negotiating credentials along with Juliana. So I'm looking forward to a good discussion. So let's start with just asking our two, not asking Kadi because she just presented, but asking our two panelists, starting with Juliana, simply to react to what Kadi said. What do you think about all this, and how do you think the implementation is playing out?
Thanks very much. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Bill, Jonathan, Kadi, and CSIS members. Thank you for having me. And as Kadi had said, it is an exciting time to be talking about these issues. And certainly I want to start by thanking Kadi for your valuable report and comprehensive presentation. As Bill has mentioned, although he did not mention, I am an original TPP negotiator. I was started negotiating or being part of negotiations back in 2012. So my first TPP round was in Auckland in December 2012. And I can say on behalf of the Australian government, as an original TPP country, as well as an original party to CPTPP, that the original intent of the TPP, of course, was to set the highest standard possible for the region, with the view to ensure that it is fit for 21st century. Now, agreeing to such a high standard agreement is one thing, but it's really only worth the agreement if we do comply with the agreement. And certainly Kati's presentation and the analysis that she's provided is very much welcome. I think it's something that the members really need and value, so as to take into account how we can improve compliance overall. I think for all of us, though, it's not just about saying what can we do now and complying with the existing agreement. It is also looking ahead. And hence this report is incredibly timely because as it happens already, it's been 5 years since the entry into force of CPTPP. And that means that for this year, the focus of the members is on the review, the general review of the agreement. So as much feedback as possible is really important and valuable because for all of us, compliance and effective compliance will add to our economies, value add to our economies, and certainly help us all grow, which is much needed at this time with all the economic uncertainty out there, but also looking at ways of addressing the cost of living pressures that all of us are facing. And that is, I'd say, the number one priority. And this is where e-commerce have a role to play. So I'll leave it at that for now, but certainly I'm very much looking forward to the discussions this morning. Thank you.
Okay. Jonathan, do you add a U.S. perspective?
Sure. Wonderful to see this report, and having worked on the original agreement, to see the rules being implemented and their durability, I think, is quite striking, highly relevant to many of the issues that we are grappling with today with respect to data flows and impact on the various evolution of respective economies. My takeaway of the report, first, excellent summary of both the importance of the sector, its role in economic growth and development, and the relevance of the rules that help guide participation in these sectors. In terms of the compliance, my takeaway is it looks really pretty good. And it is to be expected that there are some countries that are still struggling in some of these areas, Vietnam being one of the prime examples. And the areas where if some businesses are unhappy, things like paperless trading, that was, of course, not a fully binding rule. It's an endeavor to have most of your trade documents be accessible electronically. So it's understandable that perfection in that area is not yet achieved, and it's an ongoing process. It is, of course, disappointing that the U.S. is not at the table in helping to implement these rules directly. They clearly impact the U.S. companies in the region. I think what I also take away is the strong interest in having the U.S. be a part of this group. And to me, that speaks to a couple things. One is the participants in the region are adopting these rules because it is in their self-interest. They want the U.S. investment. They understand that stability in frameworks for doing business electronically are really important. And yes, they're taking it on an obligation, but they understand that it's good for them on their own. The other piece I would take away is the big debate today in the U.S. with respect to whether these rules are appropriate or not is on this whole question of quote unquote policy space. Are rules actually constraining the ability of governments to deal with challenges often in the domestic framework? And I think what this shows is that, with the possible exception of Vietnam, here TPP is 4 years old. These countries have evolved in the policies that they have been developing in dealing with new issues like harmful content, AI, etc. And the rules have not constrained them. So the notion that these types of rules are a significant constraint on policy, I don't think is borne out by the evidence this provides. The last thing I would say is, in an area looking at Vietnam, that is where one would expect a trade agreement would be able to provide a framework for governments with more experience to be able to work with a target country in helping them develop their rules in a more reasonable manner. And the one area that Kathy rightfully focused on was Decree 53. Now, what I think is interesting is the bigger impact. It has a bigger impact on U.S. companies than other companies. So the fact that we are not at the table being able to enforce a rule like that is a real detriment to the integrity of the overall agreement, because some of the other participants don't quite have the cloud computing and other sectors that would be most affected by that rule. And then finally, I would say that the interest in the U.S. joining does suggest that we do need to reorient our policies in the U.S. to try and be a little more forward-leaning in being able to take the benefits of these types of rules that are clearly important for having a robust digital space in the Far East. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that. I want to come back to some of those points because they're important, but one in particular I want to turn to Juliana to respond to. Australia gets good marks in Kadi's report. Nobody's perfect, but I guess maybe you can spend a minute or two on two questions. First of all, how is compliance coming in Australia? What kind of problems have you run into? And are you providing assistance or considering providing assistance, as Jonathan suggested, to some of the countries that are lagging, Vietnam in particular?
Sure. No, thanks for that, Bill, and also no, thank you to Jonathan for that summary too, and to be able to provide your frank assessment. I think we all need that. Firstly, I just want to say from the onset, give a bit of context for why this is so important for Australia. For us, really, people often look at Australia and may have warm and fuzzy feelings towards us, but they also consider us being a country that's so far away. And we often talk about the tyranny of distance, of course. But with the growth in digital trade technology, Australia has been brought closer to the rest of the world. And the way we see it is it's really benefited us, both in terms of our growth for the business sector, our ability to innovate, but also opportunities for our consumers as well. So for us, it's been really important to be at the forefront of, be part of the development of the rules. So it's important for us to ensure that there is an enabling environment for continuing innovation, both from the user perspective as well as the developer perspective, but also important in terms of where government fits into all this as well. So we want to be at the table, and hence we led the instigation of the joint initiative on e-commerce in Geneva, for instance. But also, it was very important for us to work with Singapore in one of our first FTA, the Singapore-Australia FTA, that was negotiated back in 2003, as being the world's first FTA with an e-commerce chapter. And that in itself had evolved, and I think that's somewhat covered in the presentation this morning as well. But as I mentioned from the onset, agreeing to these rules is one thing, but compliance is where it really matters. So for us, it was very important for Australia itself to be looking to comply with those provisions, but improve our compliance and honour those commitments. But we're also working with the region because, what's the point of being your own economy to be in compliance? It is very important for all of us to honour those commitments and consider them to be very important. So we have provided and prioritised providing cooperation and technical assistance and capacity building in particular in the future of digital trade rules in the region. And we have a wide range of cooperation through both our FTAs and in our official development program. And one of the things that we're very much focusing, of course, in our region, particularly through working with the ASEANs. Now, one good example, of course, is the ASEAN-Australia Digital Trade Standards Initiative. And it's been a program that's been running since 2018. And it's really to aim to encourage the ASEAN economies to adopt international standards. And it's not about Australia saying, hey, here's a model that we have in Australia. We're just going to give it to you and use it as a template to implement in your economies. Rather, it's about listening to each of these economies and understanding what's going on and what their needs are. Recognizing that our regulatory needs may be different, our policy objectives may be different, but nevertheless, we have the joint goal of using digital trade and e-commerce to better find commercial opportunities as well as opportunities for our consumers. And it's been a very successful program, but of course, it doesn't stop there. We have used those opportunities for cooperation to work with these economies to continue to upgrade and update the rules that apply between us as well. One of the agreements that I don't think was included in Kati's research is actually the ASEAN-Australia-New Zealand FTA, which entered into force in 2010. And I myself was the chief negotiator in the upgrade of those negotiations of that agreement last year, where we have upgraded the e-commerce chapter in particular. Now, some may say it looks very similar to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, but in fact, it is a chapter that is now going to be subject to dispute settlement chapter, which is a huge jump. And again, we're able to work with the ASEANs to get to that point on the importance of these provisions and these commitments because of all the cooperation that we have undertaken under the ASEAN-Australia-New Zealand FTA, where the Australian government committed about $30 million over the 10 years, worked on 100 projects, worked with something like 10,000 government officials across the ASEAN economies, and focused very much on a number of these issues. And going forward, we have committed double that amount in order to continue working in these issues and particularly promoting the digital trade provisions.
Okay, thank you for that. We're going to come back to some of that as well. Jonathan, as you mentioned, and as we all know, U.S. is not part of CPTPP, but we are pursuing IPEF, which I alluded to. And Australia is also an IPEF participant, so I'm going to come back to Juliana on that in a minute. But first, Jonathan, maybe you can say a few words about the differences between the two agreements, between CPTPP and IPEF in the digital space, and how you see IPEF playing out on that particular issue on digital. And then I'll come back to Juliana and ask her to comment on IPEF as well.
Sure. Text of IPEF is not public. We have some high-level goals that are articulated, so we can derive a little bit of that. And some of the press statements give some insight into what's there. I think it is fair to say that the digital provisions, as typical in trade negotiations, build on past practices, and CPTPP was one of the main foundations for practices on which one would build this. Of course, in the U.S., some of those were advanced in USMCA and in the U.S.-Japan Digital Trade Agreement, and so there are some additions. I will comment, going back to Kati's paper, on some of the things that governments considered should be expanded are relevant in the IPEF context and in what Australia is doing in further agreements. In particular, the inclusion of financial services as being covered by some of the digital trade rules. And as you noticed in Kati's paper, one of the areas of great growth in the Asia-Pacific region is in the fintech and, new word I learned, insurtech sector, which arguably is not covered by the original CPTPP, and so efforts to have rules grab that are more important. So back to IPEF. The question is whether that would be something that could be pulled into IPEF. I think at this point, those rules are in suspension, those key rules, the data flow rule, the data localization rule, the digital product rule. And so the IPEF digital piece is really right now bare bones from what I can tell in terms of enforceable binding rules. So the core of it are some of these rules, the data rule, the data localization rule, and the source code rule, and the digital product rule. Without those, I mean, you really don't have a credible digital trade approach. I think the administration is describing this as a pause, want to rethink how these rules can perhaps be adapted or reconsidered in light of some domestic interests. I'm very skeptical that there's any need to do that. And I think the evidence, again, is shown in this report that Kati has come up with, that here you have a number of countries, some of whom have very strong interests in domestic policy issues that are ostensibly what is motivating the U.S. pause, and they're able to pursue those without having the trade rules conflict with them. And so the notion that one would have to weaken some of the CPTPP type rules in order to address domestic policy concerns just doesn't strike me as a credible position. And so, yes, IPEF was an opportunity to bring forward some of these rules. I think at the moment, it's not really succeeding in that task.
Juliana, do you want to comment on that? What's the Australian view on IPEF, on digital? Are you disappointed? Do you think there's a future there?
Thanks, Bill. Sounds like, I'm going to be asked some tough questions this morning, but I'm going to have to disagree with Jonathan on one point because he uses the past tense in referring to IPEF being a lost opportunity. I'd like to say, look, IPEF continues to provide opportunities. We're still negotiating, and yes, we were hoping to have substantial conclusion in November last year on the trade agreement, including on some digital provisions. But certainly, economies remain very active and interested in continuing on those discussions. And I think for us, what's remarkable about IPEF is that it does bring together some of the largest and the smallest and most dynamic regional economies to tackle some of the economic challenges that we are facing. And it is ever changing as well. Look, it's what will happen in 2024 will look very different from 2023 even. We do also need to note that under these difficult circumstances, IPEF economies were able to still conclude and even sign 3 of the other agreements on the supply chain agreement, and the US has already ratified that agreement, of course, the Fair Economy Agreement and Clean Economy Agreements. A number of those agreements already try to look at ways for economies to cooperate in the digital space. Now, of course, we do need to look forward to negotiating the remainder of the trade agreement. But I think one of the things that we have to also note is the progress that had been made in the trade agreement already. And I can say for certain that among the economies, there is goodwill to concluding that agreement and looking at how best to incorporate our interests and sensitivities as well. And what I would say is, as an economy that very much values robust digital trade rules, we're also an economy that values data protection, personal data protection, as well as the effective enforcement of our competition laws. So we fully respect the US government's decision to pause and consider these matters as well, and consider how these rules fit in within the US's own circumstances. Certainly, having spoken to my counterparts, as well as my colleagues back in Canberra, we know that countries will continue to negotiate and consider what is the best way forward, and of course look to make the most of what the provisions that have been agreed. And some of those provisions are actually what's going to make a difference for this group of economies, because they are looking at the digital trade facilitation, whether it's e-invoicing, e-payments, e-contracts, and I think sometimes we lose sight of those type of provisions that really do matter to companies of all shapes and sizes. Thank you.
Well, let's spend a moment on the elephant that's in the room, the elephant that is always in the room on these Indo-Pacific discussions, and that's China, which has applied to become a CPTPP member, and I think actually is next in the queue, with the UK having gone through the accession process. So China's next, and maybe Juliana is probably more up to speed on what's going on internally than the rest of us. Can you say a few words about the prospects for China's accession to CPTPP? Is it likely to happen? More importantly, for this discussion, will they be able to meet the digital requirements of the agreement?
Thanks, Bill. Look, what I can say is that the CPTPP members are currently focused on implementing the outcomes of the accession process of the United Kingdom and learning the lessons of that. I know that the UK has really expedited their processes for ratification of their CPTPP accession, and my recollection is that they even have their implementing legislation tabled in their parliament for further progress. And as we reflect on the lessons and look ahead for the general review of CPTPP, as I mentioned, to be prioritised this year, there is yet to be any consensus on who the next succession candidate will be. Certainly, you know, I'm sure you will recall the CPTPP accession provisions, which provides that any economy that wants to join CPTPP must demonstrate that it can meet, implement, and adhere to the rules and high standards of the agreement, and have demonstrated track record of complying with trade commitments, as well as gain the consensus of all the existing CPTPP members. So certainly, there's a lot of work ahead for 2024, and that's what we'll be focused on. Thank you.
Very diplomatic response. Jonathan, what would China's accession mean for the United States?
So a couple things. One, to the extent that there are tariff concessions, it obviously puts U.S. production at a competitive disadvantage if we're not part of that grouping, and U.S. companies have to compete in the CPTPP markets in the face of lower tariffs that China may gain. So that's clearly not in the U.S. interest if U.S. is not part of that grouping. I think the broader concern is how the integrity of the CPTPP rules might be affected by someone like China being in there in the first place. A whole range of the rules that were negotiated are in direct contradiction to some of the current practices of China. Soon after TPP was concluded, I ran off to China with the USTR team in the face of the China bid. That was a negotiation that was also going on in parallel. At one point when we arrived, there was the chief negotiator, and on his desk was literally a foot-high stack of papers, which was the TPP agreement. The Chinese were very interested in figuring out what it meant and how it would affect their policies and whether they could actually comply with it. The only way China could comply would be having massive exceptions to the rules. So the data flow rule, the access to the internet rule, the free flow of information rule, discrimination on digital products rule, the source code rule, many of those rules were developed with in mind the way China in particular restricts a lot of the types of economic activity in ways that actually harms U.S. commercial interests. So is it in the interest of the CPP parties to actually weaken those rules simply to allow China to participate? Now, obviously, would be enormous benefits if you get tariff concessions and other investment concessions through China's participation. Obviously, the parties have that as a counter interest that they need to take into consideration. But looking at it narrowly from the digital space, it would be quite unfortunate, I think, if one of the ways in which one were to accommodate China would be essentially to got the rule to take into account their interest in information control and the types of protectionism that are part and parcel of a lot of their localization policies. So I do not think it would be in the U.S. interest for China to join. I don't think it would be in the interest of many of the TPP parties either.
So Juliana, that Jonathan's description suggests a fairly high bar for China to overcome if it's going to be able to join. It's going to have to make a lot of changes. Do you agree with him about that?
For now, all I'll say is we appreciate and welcome feedback, and we'll take them all on board.
Well, that gets to, I want to get back to the question of the effect on the U.S., but the UK came up as well in passing here. And maybe Kadi can say, I don't think you looked at the UK in your paper, did you? Or do you have any thoughts about the state of implementation there for the newest member?
Yeah, we did look at the UK. We actually looked at also, although not in the exact same framework, the potential new members as well, like China, and whether they might meet the regulations as in CPTPP today. And we found that UK is doing very well in the CPTPP. It's a good new member. for sure, adhering to the high bar that Jonathan was also mentioning. And we found that also the new applicants, countries like Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Uruguay, the Latin Americans, are doing very well as well. So they would quite meet the CPTPP standards. And definitely echo what Jonathan is saying. Anybody can read the USTR's National Trade Estimate report as well about the China's lack of compliance with these kinds of rules that would be in the CPTPP. So I would echo very much that the accession by China would undermine the integrity and the whole purpose of having well implemented gold standard rules, as Juliana, you mentioned in the beginning. That was the real intent behind the CPTPP. So very much echo that. But the UK, yeah, I think has been also a constructive member in the sense that the UK has pursued a number of trade agreements as digital trade agreements in the region, alongside acceding to CPTPP with Singapore, with Australia, with New Zealand as well. And I think those agreements, when you look at those, are also kind of forward-looking and perhaps provide a future template for the CPTPP of further rules that could be included in the CPTPP, since it's the same members essentially that are driving the adoption of great new provisions, albeit on a more best endeavor basis for now. But yeah, I think this kind of an exercise perhaps of monitoring the implementation will be a useful exercise also when the members are looking at the accessions of new members and seeking to see whether those members are meeting the high bar that CPTPP has aspired to establish.
Well, let's talk for a few minutes about where the United States is standing in all this. Several of you have alluded to that before in the IPEF context, but I think the basic question that we ought to spend a few minutes on is whether U.S. leadership in the region on digital trade is declining, and is that happening, or is the U.S. still a significant leadership presence on the issue? And second, if it is declining, is anybody else stepping up? And if so, who? So, Jonathan, why don't we start with you on that, and then we'll go to Juliana.
I think the bombshell in the WTO pulling back from these core rules does suggest that the U.S. is, if not declining, is absent from being a strong participant in the space, which is clearly unfortunate. I think longer term, I'll be optimistic that we'll get our heads around, the U.S. government will get its heads around how one can incorporate these types of rules into trade policy going forward. It's a process that needs internal debate, obviously. I do think in some areas the U.S. does have real strong future-oriented positions that people are going to keep looking for. And I would put my finger on AI as an example. So unlike the EU, which has rushed into this space and developed prescriptive rules, the U.S. is taking a lot more deliberative approach. AI is very much connected to many of the core CPTPP rules. You obviously need data to move. You obviously need massive computing facilities, which are addressed by these types of rules. And how you deal with the governance issues and the questions like quality of data and bias and so forth are real issues that the U.S. government is currently grappling with. Now, whether that can be incorporated into trade rules is something I think is hard to predict, because a lot of the outcomes are still in development, and trade rules typically wait until norms and policies are mature before trying to embody it in binding provisions. But what I think DEPA did, which I think is really helpful, is set up a mechanism for consultation. And I'm typically have not been a big fan of some of the cooperation provisions in trade agreements, but this is an area where it really is important. It's important because nobody knows exactly what the right answer is, and having mechanisms to share ideas and to work deliberatively to deal with issues that all societies face is really important. I think, again, the U.S. is well positioned in that space because we've now, through the EO, set up a process where we are looking to examine how some of these digital challenges can be met in a mechanism that doesn't undermine innovation. I think what's really the hallmark of the Asia-Pacific region is an embrace of the value of innovation, the value, and not being scared of technology, changing business models and having companies have to adapt to it in a way that in Europe is a lot more challenging. There's a lot more conservatism in the European area. So I do think that does provide a basis for the U.S. coming up with policies that other countries are really interested in how we approach it. They know they're going to be integrating these technologies into their economies, and they are going to be looking to the U.S. for cooperation and guidance on how is there a way to do so that doesn't undermine A, their domestic concerns, and B, the competitiveness in the market. I think one of the hallmarks of digital is it scales very quickly, and it scales in a way that really is very helpful to many of the businesses that are trying to trade in a cross-border manner. And I think the CPTPP governments understood that. I think the UK understood that when it started embracing many of these policies. And that scalability does speak to the need for norms that govern how people can adapt these technologies in a way that doesn't fragment the benefits that otherwise would be available if you can move in a broader and address broader markets through scalable technologies. The one area that Kati mentioned as a future-oriented aspect for CPTPP was digital standards. Now, Kati was mentioning, I think, things like invoices, the ability of companies to trade using digital invoices, which is important. I think much more important is some of the standards that are going to be emerging in things like cloud computing, in things like AI, where you really want governments to both have a common framework under which you understand how you might regulate or how you might put a constraint on a company. And governments often don't know the right answers. And what I think it has been missing in a lot of trade frameworks is the digital space. Standards typically have been a goods-oriented discipline. And what we really need to do is to bring some of those same types of disciplines into the more digital space. And in the AI area, for example, questions of bias. How do you measure an application that is resulting in bias? We don't necessarily know. But so there is a lot of foundational work that's needed that does benefit from cooperation between countries in developing international standards. A lot of this will happen by companies participating in standardization fora. What trade rules can do is cross-reference those types of outcomes that are often private sector driven. And if you have a regulation, embed in the regulation a deference to an international standard that is developed from the bottom up in a way that helps business, but also addresses some of the societal and value-oriented problems that governments obviously are trying to address. But so anyway, short answer. I think USC is well positioned in this next wave of digital technologies to play a really important role. The question is whether the trade forum is going to be a useful vehicle to do that. And so far, we're not seeing a lot of forward-looking action from the U.S. government, but I do expect that going forward we would.
Juliana, do you want to react to that? How does Australia see the U.S. leadership on digital evolving in the region? Do you agree with Jonathan or not?
There's a lot that I agree with Jonathan, particularly on the US need to take a deliberative approach. Absolutely, it's an evolving area, and we do need to think very carefully about how to strike the right balance between enabling innovation and the right to regulate for legitimate public policy purposes. We will continue to work with the US on these fronts and in developing the norms. And the other aspect that I really want to stress, like Jonathan, is it comes from cooperation. And this is where I do feel the US needs to be given credit. Let's not forget, the US hosted APEC just last year, and a big focus was on digital trade. They hosted the first digital month in Seattle in August, and it really did bring together, again, the best of US tech companies from all sizes, not just the large ones that we all know, but small ones too, as well as a number of companies across the APEC region, with a huge focus on sustainability and how digital trade has enabled a greater focus on that as well. And I don't mean to do any product placements, but I just happen to have, of course, my APEC mug with me. So I can say that certainly that's been welcomed by us. And in the difficult APEC host year, there was consensus statements out of it, including at the APEC trade ministers responsible for trade meetings in Detroit, where the ministers agreed to a set of e-invoicing principles. Again, yes, it's APEC, it's voluntary, they're principles-based, but APEC has played a very important role over the 30 years of being a policy incubator, where some of the best ideas for trade rules have come from APEC and have been brought into other forums, as well as discussed in WTO as well. So I don't think we should forget about the role that the US had played in particular in 2023, despite all the difficulties, the administration and the debates that's been taking place in Congress about a lot of these issues. Because certainly I think it's demonstrated that there's still room for cooperation, further discussion, and looking at ways of developing these norms together. Thank you.
Thank you. We're beginning to accumulate some questions in the Q&A. So just as a reminder, if you have a question, it's working. Put it in the Q&A. I've got a couple more, and then we'll turn to those. There are other regional agreements, and one of them is RCEP. The United States is also not a member of that. Let me probably ask Juliana, is in the digital, looking at specifically at digital, is RCEP relevant in this debate at all or not? I don't see it as a particularly high standard agreement when it comes to digital trade. Is that right?
Again, I would have to disagree with you on that front. We all have to start somewhere, and certainly RCEP does have an e-commerce chapter. And yes, it's true, it's not subject to dispute settlement. Nevertheless, I think the standard is there for the grouping of those countries, the 16 economies or so. And we are talking from a range of economies, from the least developing ones to the biggest economies. And that's where they've settled. And certainly for us, as I mentioned, we're able to use that experience to further setting the norms and the standards and the respect for those rules in the upgrade of the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA, where a lot of those provisions, the text may be similar to the RCEP e-commerce chapter, but we've added more, and it is subject to dispute settlement mechanism for most of the parties, with transition periods for the least developing economies. So it is a pathway for building the norms, and the way we see all these agreements is that they feed off each other, and rather than going backwards, it gives us an opportunity to go forwards. And for all these economies, through cooperation and through technical assistance, capacity building, sharing of our experiences, we are learning from each other, and we're looking to lift each other when it comes to honouring those commitments.
Jonathan, do you see a role for RCEP?
When RCEP first came out, I took a look at it and was pleasantly surprised to see that indeed there was a whole range of e-commerce relevant pieces to it. There's a data flow rule, there's a data localization rule. There was no customs duty rule because Indonesia would presumably veto that. On further reflection, I think there's a real danger in what RCEP did, and it is relevant to the current debate on how we approach rules going forward. What RCEP did was it created a rule and then said subject to domestic law or regulation, right? So in a way, it's a non-rule. It's a principle, data flows are good, but domestically you can do whatever you want, and that is legitimate, as long as there is a regulation that is constraining what otherwise would be provided for in the rule. The point of these rules is stability and certainty for business to be able to do their business and know that governments aren't arbitrarily going to change the rules of the game going forward. And I think what RCEP does is it gives such great deference to domestic ability to contradict the rule that it not only is arguably not meaningful, but it's incredibly unhelpful. You're actually telling governments that it is legitimate to take positions that are in contrast with what the rule is attempting to achieve. And if, for example, in the US, reconsideration of the IPEF rules, that is the outcome, I think, again, that's a net negative. You're actually giving a roadmap for how to violate the rule in a way that is considered acceptable, and that just isn't helpful.
But isn't that the position the US takes on all these, that if there's a conflict between US law and the agreement, US law prevails?
Well, a lot of the long process of coming up with a position on a rule is to make sure that it doesn't conflict in the first place. And of course, you can't know everything. Sometimes you miss stuff, but that's why trade negotiations take so long. You've got to do this deep dive into domestic practices and make sure that what you're binding yourself to isn't inconsistent with what's on the table. We did that in TPP. I mean, we don't have restrictions on data flows. We don't have localization requirements. We don't discriminate on digital products. There's no US law that acts inconsistently with that. The value of most of these rules is forward-looking. You want a promise from the government that, notwithstanding their current practice, in the future they won't go in a different direction and completely undermine the business model that a company has adhered to and invested in, and in a way that they can't do their business. So here, I think the debate in the US is, well, we don't know where things will land. It may be the future Congress might take a position that's inconsistent with a rule you're proposing, and that is always a challenge. Every administration, every time they put forward a rule, they don't know what Congress is going to do 5-10 years down the road. So you have to be predictive, and you have to have some confidence that you have a good sense of where the Congress is heading. The fact that everything in the past went through a very carefully organized process of consulting with Congress in the first place, so they know what the U.S. government is binding themselves to, was part of that effort to make sure that when we do take on the obligation, that Congress understands that they ought not to be legislating in contradiction with that going forward. If they do, that is their prerogative, and the whole point of a trade agreement is you suffer some consequences through potential retaliation or dispute settlement from your partner. But that is the nature of the process for the past 50 years.
Okay, let's turn to the audience questions now, because we've got a collection of them that I want to make sure that we cover, and actually some of these are for Kadi too. So I'm going to go roughly in the order in which they arrived. The first one is from Bhagyashree Garakar of the Straits Times. So a journalist question. Personally, I'd love to answer this one, but I leave it to the panelists. Who do the panelists judge to be friendlier to the cause of digital trade, President Biden or Donald Trump? Anybody who wants to be brave and answer that? Jonathan? Opinion?
That one is a tough one. So I was at USTR under the Trump administration. Trade was obviously a very contentious issue. The digital space, I think, was one of the bright spots from my perspective in where we landed. The Trump administration took what was essentially negotiated in TPP and put it into both USMCA and in the Japan Digital Trade Agreement. So in that sense, it was very friendly to some of the digital trade peers. Not across the board. There's plenty of areas where there was disagreements. With certainly with some of the particular companies, but it ended up coming up with very, very useful rules. I think the Biden administration wants to do things differently, and it is of course their prerogative to rethink whether the rules that have been brought in from the past are consistent with the direction they want to go in. I don't really understand where they're headed. So I think it really is a question of limbo and not certainty. You can't yet draw a conclusion other than there's a lot of skepticism about the role of technology and the role of particular companies in particular areas. But in terms of trade policy, it's really just a limbo rather than anything in particular that one can point to as good or bad.
Anybody else brave enough to weigh in on this one? Okay, let's go to the next one. This one is for Kati from Hugh Stevens. Have you done any comparative analysis with regard to digital readiness on the part of Taiwan and China using the same criteria applied to current CPTPP members?
Yeah, so we did. It's a good question. We did. Am I muted? You hear me now?
You're back now. Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah. So we did an analysis, and it's in the paper of China and Taiwan, as well as the other applicants. And indeed, China does not meet the rules or at least the bar that we have set for good implementation. Taiwan did. So by and large, Taiwan seemed to have the right framework and the readiness to exceed, as did the Latin American applicants.
Okay, the next question comes from Marianne Rowden, old friend. This may take a couple of minutes if anybody wants to tackle it. Can you address how trade agreement rules in CPTPP and IPEF are impacted by the direct and indirect tax issues, specifically OECD Pillar 2 and the WTO moratorium on customs duties? Anybody want to take that one on?
I'm happy to jump in.
You can try.
Yeah. I think customs duties is pretty straightforward. CPTPP has a binding rule, no customs duties, and so we're a country to put in place a customs duty that would be directly conflicting with it. DSTs are more complicated. The rules don't specifically talk about digital services taxes. What I think is the case, however, is if you look, for example, at the USTR critique of what France did on digital services taxes, the framework was 301. Is this an unreasonable constraint on U.S. business? But there's also a discrimination analysis. And in the French example, USTR concluded that it indeed was discriminatory. You had a U.S. company that was required to pay a DST, and there would be a French company that would be exempt from it. Which brings you right into a national treatment issue. And because these broad FTA rules have very broad national treatment obligations, and if a country put in place a DST that really was targeting one subset of players to the exclusion of domestic like suppliers, there would be a national treatment problem. And that is, for example, something that is a live issue right now with Canada, because Canada is proposing a DST. They've got very broad national treatment obligations, and we certainly are of the view that it would be inconsistent with USMCA for them to move forward with a DST based on the discriminatory effect of such taxes.
That was comprehensive. Anybody else want to add anything? Okay, let's go on to the next one. The next one is, I think I'll ask Juliana if she wants to tackle this one. Also from Hugh Stevens, China has been answered. What about Taiwan? which I assume refers to possible accession to CPTPP.
Thanks, Bill, for throwing that one at me. But look, Hugh, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but it's the same answer, which is we're currently focusing on implementing the outcomes of the accession process of the United Kingdom and looking to undertake the general review, which we consider to be very important to ensure the fit for purpose nature of CPTPP. But certainly, any economy that wants to join CPTPP must demonstrate that it can meet the height standards and has a practice track record of compliance with those standards and need consensus support of all the CPTPP partners. So certainly, we've got a number of economies that have shown interest in acceding to CPTPP, and we welcome their interests and we'll continue to consider them.
Okay, the next one comes from a former colleague at CSIS, Casey Onu. What kind of compromise in the digital trade provisions in IPEF would members have to make to entice the U.S. to resume negotiations? I think I would amend that a little bit to say, per what Juliana said earlier, the negotiations haven't gone away, so it's not a question of resuming. Let's rephrase and say, what compromises would have to be made to get the U.S. to be able to come to closure on IPEF digital provisions?
Bill, I'm happy to have a go at that, but I'm also interested in hearing from the other panelists on this. I think what's interesting about IPEF negotiations is that it's not a traditional trade negotiation as such. It's not about compromises of that kind of nature. It's more about to what extent do we see these rules and the norms that we're developing being beneficial for all of us in terms of our economic needs and our policy objectives. So as I understand the US position, it's not so much about getting more or compromises and the give and takes on this front. It is genuinely about taking a pause to consider how these rules fit with considerations to be given to personal data protection as well as enforcement of competition policy rules. We understand that and we respect that, and we do very much hope to continue to work collaboratively and closely with the US and the other IPEF economies in negotiating the best possible type of trade agreement that we can among the partners, and that really meet all our policy goals in that front. Thank you.
Jonathan or Kadi, either one of you want to add anything?
Well, I mean, the publicly stated focus on IPEF has circulated around the issue of enforceable labor rights, and whether moving forward without enforceable labor rights is appropriate or not. I would simply say that that is a high demand on a lot of these countries. If you're asking countries to put in place laws or regulations in a way that's helpful in that space, and those are clearly U.S. policy, U.S. values that would be reflected in them, it is quite a cost to some of the participants in the market. And so I think the question, and I'm speculating here from the perspective of some of the other participants, if the U.S. demand is a pretty high cost change domestically in exchange for participation in something that is valuable but doesn't have immediate tangible benefits like digital trade rules, which many of the participants like, it's a tough sell, for those other participants. I would look back to, for example, the CPTPP negotiations, where labor was one of the core goals there as well. And if you look at one country, for example, Vietnam was asked to put in place laws that allowed workers to form unions and negotiate. very controversial domestically for the Vietnamese, mainly relating to concerns over the regime, the role that labor unions played in their political system. Vietnam did it. They abided by, or they negotiated a rule that did allow workers to come together and negotiate. They did it because there was an enormous sweetener for them on the side of some tariff concessions that the U.S. was offering. So the notion that one can put forward valid goals in the U.S., but without providing a quid pro quo on the U.S. side that's tangible for these participants is quite a challenge, I think. And I think the goals are good. It's just that this is not a dynamic where being able to accomplish those two goals really does look feasible.
Okay, we've got two more. Let's try to squeeze them in before we run out of time here. The next one is also from KC. Are there any other novel provisions, like on financial services, expected to be included in digital trade provisions anytime soon?
I mean, I can take, Bill, some of that, maybe echoing a little bit what Jonathan was saying on AI. I think there's a lot of demand from companies, big and small in Asia Pacific, for rules around AI governance, or at least principles and standards, as Jonathan mentioned. And I think the EO that we have is a very good start, as he mentioned. So perhaps some of the new provisions that businesses are demanding relate to these digital standards, AI standards, as well as then, of course, what Juliana mentioned, the more standards related to the more physical movement of goods. That's what we see in data. We certainly see a huge explosion of use of AI in the region. More than 50%. We did some surveys, and more than 50% of micro businesses in the CPTPP region are already adopting AI one way or the other in their work. There's thousands of companies emerging in the CPTPP region that are kind of startups driven by AI, whether it's in transport or financial services or what have you. So this is really happening very quickly, and these are scalable businesses, as Jonathan mentioned. So I would say couple of these areas would be great to go into greater depth in trade agreements. One is this AI governance, and having collaboration on AI, on things like how do we assess the risk of different AI applications? How do we test AI applications against cybersecurity risks or misuse? And how do we ensure the interoperability of AI governance across countries? And there are already in trade agreements principles on AI ethics, for instance, I believe was addressed in the Singapore-UK digital trade agreement. So there's definitely opportunities to learn from existing practices and go from there.
Okay. The next one from Marianne Rowden is actually a really important one. Do the panelists see these regional trade agreements outstripping the WTO on e-commerce and digital trade, so that we really don't get globally consistent trade rules? Who wants to take that one on?
I mean, I can start very quickly just by saying that we have this common template that was inspired by CPTPP, and that has been adopted very much across these different trade agreements in the Asia Pacific. So in a way, we have from bottom up come up with a global template that's also very consistent and applied in the USMCA. That has probably inspired quite a lot of the discussions in, for instance, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, digital protocol discussions. So in a way, there is a global template. And my understanding is, and Juliana, you're better placed perhaps to talk about this, is that this template has very much inspired what's going on at the multilateral level, at the WTO as well. So in a way, there is a consistency among the number of levels. And again, as in many areas, it is the regional that has been pushing has been the innovator and has been pushing the global, if you want. So to me, there is a lot of opportunities if we just get these agreements actually in place at the WTO, multilateral level, and implemented well at the regional levels.
Anybody
That's a
else
great
want to
question.
comment on that one?
Yeah, very happy to add further to what Katia has said, and absolutely, look, for Australia, we are multilateralists through and through. And certainly when we embarked on the TPP and RCEP negotiations way back when, the idea had always been that these mega regional trade agreements would serve as building blocks for the WTO and eventually lead to somewhere. Now, we're not quite there yet, but nevertheless, we have been making progress in the WTO Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce. And in fact, on the 20th of December, just before Christmas, the co-conveners were able to announce substantial conclusion of a number of core provisions of those negotiations. And I know my colleagues from Canberra and Geneva are working very closely with co-conveners from Singapore and Japan in particular to put out a chair's text soon. So, and certainly, you know, the way we're proceeding with this negotiations that involve somewhat 90 members is to look to build on those rules, to be inspired by those rules and draw from those rules. And I don't think any of us are talking about inconsistency or outstripping necessarily. It is trying to find consensus among such a large grouping of countries in a very important area. Thank you.
Okay, one more question came in late, and I do want to squeeze it in because it's an interesting one, and then we'll wrap up. This is from Scott Thompson. The panel mentioned how Vietnam is lagging in digital trade. The government in Hanoi might disagree with that assessment after employing different criteria. The benefits of digital trade might be clear from the international perspective, but how would you describe the benefits to Vietnam if it were to loosen the reins? Anybody want to tackle that one?
Happy to jump in here.
We're out of time, so keep it short.
So when we were negotiating TPP, Vietnam did put forward a proposal to have cloud computing be required to be provided locally. They thought, you know what, we can help our cloud computing business by putting a mandate in here. What happened was a lot of the entrepreneurs said, that's terrible. We rely on global cloud computing resources. If you do that, our competitive advantage will be undermined. And so they abandoned that rule, unfortunately, and it really was in their interest because they've got some very talented software engineers and app developers that, you know, wanted world-class facilities rather than what could be mandated by the government. I think the same thing is evident in Decree 53. So in Decree 53 that we earlier talked about, there is deference to foreign firms able to move data in and out of Vietnam. But the requirement on a Vietnamese firm is that you store the data locally. So on its face, that looks like you're just discriminating against the foreigners. But you also are discriminating against a foreign entity offering, for example, a cloud computing service. If I want to be able to sell to that entrepreneur or to that business in Vietnam, they are constrained. Their government tells them that they have to store the government locally. That is not in the interest of that company, as in the cloud computing example I gave before, because they may well want to access facilities that are not available domestically, and being required to store and process domestically and undermines Vietnam's own competitiveness. Now, they have reasons for wanting to store it, whether it's privacy, security, et cetera, but what we found is that those all can be addressed without mandating local storage and processing.
Well, excellent. Thank you very much to the panel. We are out of time. Thank you to Kadi for the paper, and to Juliana and Jonathan for further enlightening us about what's going on in this space, in this region. A very good discussion. We look forward to Kadi's next paper on this subject, which will further look at implementation. Meanwhile, you will be able to see this again. If you were not able to get all of it, we'll post the entire episode on the website later on, hopefully today. We will also post Kadi's slides, and when the publication is ready and to come out, we will post it there as well for further review by all of you and discussion. So thank you, everybody, and we'll say goodbye right now.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you very much.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.